Some betrayals happen loudly. You see them coming. You feel them building. You have time to prepare yourself for the impact. And then there are the quiet ones. The ones that happen slowly over years while someone smiles at you across the dinner table. The ones that only reveal themselves fully when you are sitting in a lawyer's office 3 days after burying your mother and hearing words that make the floor disappear beneath you. This is a story about that kind of betrayal, and about what one young woman did with $20,000 and a box of jewelry when she could have done absolutely nothing at all. Welcome to Unfiltered Chronicles. Sarah was 23 years old when her mother died. And before I tell you what happened after that, I need to tell you what her mother had built. Because you cannot understand what was taken from Sarah without understanding what her mother had created from nothing. Her mother had started a catering company in their kitchen when Sarah was 3 years old. Just a woman alone with a young daughter, a set of recipes, and an absolute refusal to depend on anyone else for the life she wanted to build. She had started with small orders. Birthday cakes, neighborhood events, anything she could get. Then small orders became larger orders. Larger orders became corporate contracts. Corporate contracts became a reputation that spread across the entire city. By the time Sarah was a teenager, her mother's company had 12 employees, a client list that included some of the most prestigious events in the city, and a name that people in the industry genuinely respected. 30 years. Built entirely from scratch, built entirely alone. And from the time Sarah was old enough to understand what her mother was doing, she was part of it. Weekends spent helping at events. Summers learning every recipe, every supplier relationship, every client preference. She did not just grow up alongside the business. She grew up inside it. It was as much a part of her identity as her own name. Her mother told her the same thing for 20 years. This is yours one day, Sarah. Everything I built is for you. 20 years of the same promise. 20 years of building toward the same future. And then when Sarah was 19, her mother met Richard. Richard was charming, attentive, exactly the kind of man that a woman who had spent 2 decades building something alone and raising a daughter alone and never once asking anyone for anything would find completely disarming. He made her mother laugh. He made her feel seen. He showed up consistently and warmly, and Sarah genuinely tried to be happy for her mother because her mother deserved happiness. She had earned it 100 times over. But Richard came with 2 sons, Daniel, who was 26, and Cooper, who was 24. And from the moment they entered her mother's life, the atmosphere around the business began to shift in ways that were subtle enough to dismiss individually but impossible to ignore collectively. Business meetings that had always included Sarah started happening without her. Supplier relationships her mother had spent years carefully nurturing started being handled by Daniel. Cooper started appearing at events Sarah had always managed. Decisions that had always been made between Sarah and her mother started being made between her mother and Richard. Sarah went to her mother privately. She raised her concerns as calmly and carefully as she could. Her mother told her she was imagining things, that Richard and his sons were trying to help, that there was room for everyone and that nothing was changing between them. Sarah believed her, because she had no reason not to, because this was her mother. Because 20 years of the same promise felt like something solid enough to stand on. Then her mother got sick. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The diagnosis arrived quickly and the timeline the doctors gave was devastating. 6 to 8 months. Sarah did not hesitate for a single moment. She moved back home immediately. She took leave from her job. She became everything her mother needed all at once. Caregiver, cook, cleaner, business manager, client contact, staff coordinator. She was doing the work of 4 people simultaneously while watching her mother get smaller and quieter and further away every single week. Richard was present in the house, but he was not present in the way that mattered. His sons visited occasionally, but their visits were social rather than practical. The actual work of caring for her mother fell almost entirely on Sarah's shoulders, and she carried it without complaint because this was her mother and there was nothing she would not do. She sat with her mother through every treatment. She held her hand through the worst nights. She kept the business running so that the thing her mother had built for 30 years would still be standing when Sarah needed it to be. Her mother died for months after the diagnosis. Sarah did not have time to grieve the way grief requires. 3 days after the funeral, she was called to a lawyer's office for the reading of the will. She sat down in that office across from Richard and his two sons. She had not slept properly in months. She had barely eaten. She was running entirely on the kind of exhausted determination that takes over when there is simply no other option available. She sat down and she waited to hear her mother's voice one final time through the document that would transfer everything those 30 years had built into Sarah's hands where it had always been promised to go. The lawyer began reading. The business had been left to Richard. The house had been left to Richard. The savings account had been left to Richard. A life insurance policy Sarah had not known existed had been left to Richard. Sarah had been left $20,000 and a box of her mother's jewelry. She sat in that lawyer's office and she could not breathe. She could not think. She could not process what she was hearing against the backdrop of 20 years of the same promise repeated over and over in her mother's voice. "This is yours one day, Sarah. Everything I built is for you. $20,000. After 23 years of being promised everything, after growing up inside that business, after moving home and giving up her job and spending 4 months doing everything for everyone while Richard and his sons contributed almost nothing to her mother's care. $20,000 and a box of jewelry." She looked at Richard across that table. He met her eyes for exactly 1 moment and then looked away. She did not cry. She did not speak. She did not give any of them the satisfaction of seeing what that moment cost her. She collected her copy of the will. She stood up, and she walked out of that office without saying a single word. What happened to her mother's business over the following 6 months was painful to watch even from a distance. Richard kept the business. Daniel took over day-to-day management despite having no experience in catering. No knowledge of the clients, no understanding of the supplier relationships, and no appreciation for what it had taken to build any of it. Cooper handled client communications despite never having met most of them. The staff her mother had carefully recruited and retained for years began leaving almost immediately. They had not signed up to work for Richard and his sons. They had worked for Sarah's mother because they respected her and trusted her and believed in what she was building. The clients began canceling their contracts. The reputation that had taken 30 years to build began deteriorating under the weight of missed deadlines, poor communication, and an obvious absence of the care and quality that had made the company what it was. Within 6 months, it was over. Richard sold off the remaining equipment and contracts for a fraction of their actual value, collected whatever money was left, and moved on as though 30 years of someone else's work had simply been a financial instrument that had run its course. Sarah watched all of this happen, and while she watched, she was doing something very specific with her time and with the $20,000 she had been left. She was not spending it on rent. She was not spending it on therapy or anger or the kind of paralysis that betrayal this deep can cause in people who have every right to be paralyzed by it. She enrolled in a business management course. She contacted 3 of her mother's most loyal former employees who had left when Richard took over and told them what she was planning. She reached out to 4 of her mother's largest former clients who had canceled their contracts after the quality collapsed and asked each of them for a single meeting. Every single one of those former employees said yes immediately. Every single one of those former clients said yes immediately. Because they remembered Sarah, they had watched her grow up. They had seen her working at their events since she was a teenager. They knew exactly who had been responsible for the quality they had trusted, and they had been waiting for exactly this phone call. 6 months after sitting in that lawyer's office with $20,000 and a box of jewelry, Sarah registered a new catering company. She hired her mother's 3 best former employees as her founding team. She signed contracts with 4 of her mother's biggest former clients on the same day she opened her doors. She named the company after her mother's middle name so that everything she built would carry her mother's memory forward in the most permanent way she could think of. She was 24 years old. She had $20,000 in startup capital. She had no safety net and no backup plan and no one offering to help her if things went wrong. She had her mother's recipes, her mother's relationships, her mother's knowledge that she had spent 20 years absorbing without even realizing how valuable it would one day become. And she had the kind of quiet, determined fury that only comes from having something that was always rightfully yours taken away by someone who never deserved it. 3 years later, Sarah's company had grown beyond anything her mother's original business had ever achieved. 20 employees, a client list that was larger and more prestigious than the one her mother had spent 30 years building, industry awards, a reputation that had been built in 3 years through sheer quality and integrity, and the relationships that had always existed between Sarah and the people who had loved her mother's work. Richard had not fared as well. He had spent through the money from the house sale and the business assets within 2 years. The savings were gone. The life insurance policy had been consumed by the lifestyle that followed. Daniel and Cooper had moved on to other things, having contributed meaningfully to the destruction of something genuinely valuable and learned absolutely nothing from the experience. Sarah had not thought about Richard for months when her phone rang one afternoon with a number she did not recognize. She almost did not answer. She answered. It was Richard. He explained that things had been difficult recently, that he was in a challenging financial situation, that the years had not been kind, and that he was not sure where to turn. He told her that he had always considered her family, that her mother would have wanted them to look out for each other, that he was wondering whether Sarah might be in a position to help him in some way. Sarah sat and listened to every single word he said. She did not interrupt. She did not raise her voice. She did not remind him of the lawyer's office or the will or the $20,000 or the 30 years of her mother's work that had been consumed and discarded in 6 months. When he finished speaking, she was quiet for a moment. Then she told him very calmly that she was sorry to hear things had been difficult, that she genuinely hoped he would find the support he needed, that she was sure there were people and resources that could help him through this challenging time. And then she said the thing that she had been saving without even knowing she was saving it. She told him she was sure he was strong enough to stand on his own. And she hung up the phone. I have thought about Sarah's story many times since I first heard it. And the thing that stays with me is not the betrayal, though the betrayal was profound. It is not the will or the lawyer's office or the 6 months of watching everything get destroyed. It is what Sarah did with $20,000 when she had every right to do nothing at all. She could have been consumed by what happened. She could have spent years in legal battles or in bitterness or in the kind of grief that takes over completely when loss and betrayal arrive at the same time. Nobody would have blamed her. What was done to her was genuinely wrong and genuinely devastating, and the anger she must have felt in that lawyer's office would have been completely justified if it had swallowed her whole. But Sarah understood something that took her mother 30 years to teach her without ever saying it directly. The best response to someone taking what is yours is not to fight for what was taken. It is to build something better. Richard did not just steal a business. He stole the future that 30 years of her mother's work had been pointing toward. And Sarah looked at that theft and decided that the most powerful thing she could do was make that future happen anyway, without the inheritance, without the head start, without any of the things that should have been hers. She built it from $20,000 and a box of jewelry and 20 years of knowledge that nobody had thought to account for when they were dividing up everything else. And when Richard called asking for help, she gave him the only thing he deserved, the same words she had been given. She was sure he was strong enough to stand on his own. If you have ever had something taken from you that was rightfully yours, if you have ever been handed far less than you deserved by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, If you are currently sitting with your version of $20,000 and a box of jewelry wondering what comes next, this story is for you. Build anyway. Thank you for listening to Unfiltered Chronicles. Subscribe for new stories every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And drop your own story in the comments below. We read every single one.